All right, everyone. We still have a ton of people coming in, but in the interest of time, we are going to get started. Already there are nearly 500 people who are joining this, who have joined this call, with many, many more that we're expecting. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our first webinar in a new series that's focused on blockchain's ability to address major global problems. Our first webinar today is called Blockchain and Pandemics. And arguably, there's really no greater challenge that we all face collectively than the threat of COVID-19. COVID-19 has had a pretty profound and irrevocable impact on our world. The economic costs have been devastating. The human costs so far have been frankly unfathomable, with the worst yet to come. And I think it's fair to say that the world is going to be a very different place when the dust settles from this. So first and above all, we hope that you're all well. I'm sure many of you are holed away in your homes and following the social distancing guidelines. We want to make sure that everyone stays safe and healthy, and we believe that together we will get through this. So we have launched a series of major projects on pandemics, both the response and also the recovery. The first deliverable from these projects is our big report, which we're very excited to announce the release of today, called Blockchain Solutions in Pandemics, which will be available to everyone who has joined this call. Key input for this report came from the roundtable, which we hosted last week with 40 leading experts, in addition to our own extensive research into the area and a number of other primary sources. Of course, we know there are many tools that are going to be required to address the issue of COVID-19, to overcome it and to prepare for the future. Blockchain alone is not a panacea by any means. You know, if blockchain is a hammer, we don't want to use it when a saw or a screwdriver might potentially be a better tool. Still, we see at least 5 major areas where blockchain can have an immediate impact on addressing this crisis and a long-term impact on preparing for and preventing future crises, which we will get into. As no doubt many of you know, today actually would have been the opening day for Blockchain Revolution Global, our flagship event, which was to be hosted in Toronto at the Convention Center. The dates have now been moved for that event to October 27th, 28th, and 29th, and you can buy tickets for that event online today. We're still very glad that we could convene a large number of people, business and government leaders, entrepreneurs, enthusiasts, and others on this call. As it turns out, we actually had we will have close to 1,000 people on this call. It turns out that Zoom has a limit of 1,000 people. So unfortunately, some people were unable to join, which is a good reminder for you and your colleagues and your friends that for future webinars, please make sure to sign up early. The fact that we were actually able to convene such a large group of people, I think, on such short notice, speaks not only to the reach and the impact of the Blockchain Research Institute, but also to the urgency of the crisis and the yearning for practical and actionable solutions. I'm looking at the people who are signing in, and thank you all very much for mentioning where you're from. Just off the top of off the top of this list here, I see Jordan, India, Serbia, Rome, Germany, Canada, the United States, Brazil, Spain, Australia, Dubai, Ecuador, South Africa, and someone from Portugal, Pakistan, Lebanon, Turkey, Ohio, San Marino, and Nova Scotia, Canada, to name a few. We're all delighted that you were able to join us, and we look forward to the discussion. For those of you who are on the call, please note that at the end, we will be providing a link to access the Blockchain Solutions in Pandemics report. So please make sure to stay until the end. We're very excited to bring together an expert group of panelists today. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce them. The first panelist is Heather Flannery. So Heather Flannery is the global lead of Consensus Health, and she's also the co-founder and a board chair of Blockchain in Healthcare Global. As an aside, Consensus Systems is a company that's been at the forefront of this industry for many years. They were instrumental in building and scaling the Ethereum network. And one funny anecdote, when Don Tapscott, the co-founder and executive chairman of the BRI and the co-author of Blockchain Revolution, and I were together visiting Consensus in the fall of 2015, we actually bore witness to the actual launch of the Ethereum network with the creation of the Genesis block. And it's been quite an amazing journey since then as the company has diversified into a number of other areas. Healthcare is obviously an enormous and important and critical industry, and Heather and her team are doing really brilliant work. Heather also co-chairs the Global HIMSS Blockchain and Healthcare Task Force, chairs the Healthcare Special Interest Group at the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, and is an associate editor of the peer-reviewed journal Frontiers Blockchain for Science. And she has a lot of other amazing qualifications and credentials, which I won't get into. Our second panelist is David Jaffrey. So Dr. David Jaffrey is the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology and Digital Officer at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. So MD Anderson is one of the key institutions of the Texas Medical Center, which is the biggest hospital campus and network in the entire United States. And he obviously, given his expertise and position, will have a lot to say on preparedness and technology as it relates to this crisis. David is also a professor of radiation physics with a dual appointment as professor of imaging physics. And in this role, he directs the strategic design, acquisition, management, and implementation of an enterprise-wide technology infrastructure at MD Anderson to safeguard the integrity and availability of the institution's systems and its intellectual property assets. And he also has many other qualifications, which we won't get into. And the final panelist is Brian Bellendorf, who is the executive director of Hyperledger. Hyperledger is an affiliate organization of the Blockchain Research Institute and one of our founding members. And they have been a really great partner and collaborator with us. Hyperledger has one of the largest technology repositories, one of the most robust networks in this entire industry, and is currently being used by dozens of large institutions, companies, and governments all around the world. Brian Bellendorf was a primary developer of the Apache web server, the most popular web server software on the internet, and he's also a founding member of the Apache Software Foundation. He's also served on the board of the Mozilla Foundation since 2003 and the Electronic Frontier Foundation since 2013. Brian was the founding CTO of CollabNet and CTO of the World Economic Forum. And most recently, Brian was a managing director at Mitrial Capital Management, a global technology investment firm. So needless to say, it's an abundance of riches. We want to jump right into it. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Don Tapscott, the executive chairman of the Blockchain Research Institute, the co-founder of the Blockchain Research Institute, the co-author of Blockchain Revolution, and the author and co-author of more than a dozen books on the influence of technology on business. He doesn't really need much more of an introduction. If you're on this call, you've likely joined to hear in part to what Don has to say. He's also my dad, and he's a really swell fellow. So with that, I will hand it over to Don. Go for it.
Thanks so much, Alex. I'm just sharing the screen here. I hope that everyone can see a title slide. Can you see it, Alex? Just let me know. Hope you're muted.
It says that you've started screen sharing, but I do not see the slides at the moment. Let's see if anybody else does. We can't see your screen. No, we can't see. So the other members, the people who've joined, cannot see it either.
If you turn sharing off and turn it back on, it'll get unstuck.
Thank you. Sharing is off.
We bring the big guns onto these webinars for troubleshooting IP issues.
Any success yet?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Let's get into it. I just want to set this up. By the way, we will be releasing this webinar and to the public. And if anyone wants to tweet while it's on, please feel free to do that. You know, it's easy to look up the names of the other folks, and Alex and I. Alex is at Alex Tapscott, and I'm at D Tapscott. So we're very proud. Let me begin by saying that with the report that's been released, it's will be released at the end of this webinar, and do hang in there till the end, and you'll receive the URL for it. Most of the work that we do is proprietary to the members of the BRI, and after a period of 6 months to 12 months, we release it under a Creative Commons license. Thanks. But we decided for this particular set of projects that we've launched related to the pandemic and also economic recovery that we want to release a lot of this material right away. So we hope that you enjoy the report. It was quite a big group effort. And as Alex mentioned, it was based on a roundtable for which David, Heather, and Brian were 3 of 30 participants from 5 continents that came up with the insights for this. Just a word on how we think about this technology, because we have people of many different levels who are here today. Blockchain to us is not some interesting new technology, but it's really at the heart of the second era of the digital age. And insofar as the users of data like machine learning and AI are important, blockchain is in many ways the transactional platform and the provider of data, which is going to be so critical to the future. So this is the second era of the digital age, and blockchain to us is the second era of the internet. We created a framework, and it's 5 parts to think about this, this topic. First of all, it has to do with supply chains. And supply chains are obviously a critical infrastructure for our globally connected economy. And the coronavirus has put them under tremendous strain, exposing all kinds of potential weaknesses and problems. And everywhere you've got these systems that are based on decades old technology, traditional ERP systems, EDI, electronic data interchange, traditional IT, have resulted in very severe shortages in everything, protective equipment from masks and gloves to ventilators as well. And also driven by fear and transparency in supply chains, consumers have panicked. Lack of transparency in supply chains, and they've been emptying shelves of many staples. And there are so many memes and jokes about this. Some of this is not very funny, but with some consumers hoarding years of toilet paper, I mean, why would you do that? If you knew, if there was a supply chain that was transparent and told you, actually, you don't need to have 3 years of toilet paper because some is coming shortly. It's caused at least one wealthy person to say, let them use bidets. But the joke is not so funny because the bidet market soared only to be hit by shortages too. So our view is that supply chain is will be found based on blockchains in the future. It's a $50 trillion industry globally. And we do need supply chains that are transparent, that are high metabolism, high performance, where information can be processed quickly and where participants can trust that the information about goods is accurate and even know the provenance of information. So in our research, we've come up with a number of different aspects to this. The first is the tracking and procuring of medical supplies. And blockchain's already used as a platform for tracking all kinds of things. Everledger and a broader multi-stakeholder network has pretty much eliminated the problem of conflict diamonds that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The IBM Food Trust helps companies identify the source of contaminated food quickly. Circular helps to expose unethical practices in cobalt mining. And one initiative, one of the participants in the roundtable was a company called Remedy Chain that's using blockchain to capture unused pharmaceuticals. And that's a big one. Secondly, it's a sad thing, but there's nothing like a crisis to bring out the worst in people. Brings out the best too, but the worst. So a Risk IQ, a threat intelligence consultancy, saw a massive spike in pandemic scams targeting vulnerable and people desperate for medical supplies. Well, we all know with blockchain, you can know the authenticity of something. Third, how do we move medical supplies quickly from one country to another? It's not easily in today's global supply chains. Most still rely heavily on opaque, time-consuming, and costly processes. Documentation is largely paper-based, unbelievably, and handled manually. I remember one of our colleagues and our members from FedEx describing that inside of a railway car is a little box with an envelope at the top that shows that says what's in the car, and in that envelope is paper. And approvals from multiple parties at each checkpoint often cause delays and are susceptible to fraud and cross-border orders. Catching mistakes in compliance and control is very difficult. This is the kind of stuff that blockchain is ideally suited for. Next, how can we best mobilize manufacturing and distributing resources, including intellectual property, to be able to deliver supplies to the frontline people in a secure and efficient manner? So James Reganar, one of the participants in the roundtable, is also on this call right now. It's a company that's 3D printing capability, and the next one up is going to be ventilators on the premises of the customer, and all of the transactions and compliance and so on are handled through a blockchain. So you'll read in the report, these are just some of the applications having to do with the provenance in pharmaceuticals. Secondly, and I'm sorry for moving along here quickly, but I want to get through this. Data is the most powerful asset in fighting pandemics, and we'll hear from David Jaffrey about that. But if governments, citizens, clinicians, and so on had access to data about the virus, they could take effective steps against it. And data comes in a number of categories here. We need data about what, where, when, how, and who. Okay? So how many people are affected? Where are they located? When were they affected? And when did they recover? How were they affected? And who else did they contact? So how are we going to manage this in society? Well, this is a subset of a broader issue about data, that the data from your body, your movement, for example, or for that matter, your temperature or your heart rate, is data that comes from your body, just like is all the data about what you spend and what you got on a test and so on. But that data tends to be captured by a very small group of companies, and in some cases governments. And this has created a much broader issue that has to do with all this data representing our identity. We create the data, but it's captured by others, and that's a really big problem. That means that you can't use the data to plan your own healthcare, your movement, or your lives. It means that you can't monetize the data, and a small handful of organizations are getting enormously wealthful using our data. It means that data is not secure because there are two types of central servers, which is where this stuff runs: those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. And it also means that that your privacy is undermined. And people say, well, you know, privacy, especially in a crisis, is stupid. Get over it. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but fundamentally it's not true. The privacy is the foundation of freedom, and we need to get our privacy back. So imagine a scenario whereby your body is generating this data through all kinds of wearables and so on, and it's captured in a self-sovereign health record on a blockchain, and it moves around with you, and that's part of your broader identity. And by law, governments can mandate that citizens make available anonymized data and critical healthcare information, like, say, body temperature or location, for aggregate tracking and predictive purposes in a crisis. Governments could instruct, or citizens could instruct their digital identities to provide pertinent health information to any registered clinician who needs it, and non-anonymized. Maybe you decide I don't want to disclose my mental health information or something like that, but you disclose pertinent information. A smart contract managing their identity would be released to all kinds of other information. Thirdly, incentive systems could reward us for making our private data available, and more on that later. Fourth, all these data would represent an entire population of all of the citizens, not just a sample or some partial or misleading subset of that. And never before could we had something like this. Clinicians, epidemiologists, authorities could have such extraordinary access to a wealth of data, and using all this next generation analytical material and techniques and AI and so on, they could understand possible trajectories of a virus. And five, as individuals recover from a virus or develop an immunity, perhaps through a vaccination, they could receive what MIT Sandy Pentland calls a health certification to attach to their digital identity. So the exciting thing about this approach is we could have our cake too and eat it too. We could have all the massive detailed data that's required to manage a crisis like this. At the same time, we could protect the basic rights of citizens. It's an extraordinary opportunity. All right, speeding it up. People respond to incentives. That's a consensus among behavioral economists, and it's a theme of a lot of public policy. So how are we going to get people to do the right thing? You remember Spike Lee's film, Do the Right Thing, where a whole community of people, some of them acted doing the right thing sometimes, but they didn't all do the right thing, and that resulted in a community meltdown. So there's sort of two approaches to this. One is the state forces this. Sometimes that's the best thing to do to defend freedom. Sometimes the best thing to do to defend freedom is to do what you're told. But the problem is that in authoritarian societies, that tends to hang around and become the norm. The second is that people decide that they're going to act with integrity. And we've done a lot of work, and you read about it in the report, about incentive systems that enable more intrinsic motivations and incentives that enable people to do the right thing. And I'm guessing most people on this webinar, and there's some like 1,000 of you, are self-isolating, not because it's the law, but because it was the right thing to do. So how do we get an entire population to do that? Fourth, skills and talents. You know, the two really big issues here is getting all the right people at the right time. So with licensing, we need to issue medical certifications, and that can be done on a blockchain. And staffing, we describe in some length the concept of a global medical talent marketplace. And there are a dozen blockchain companies that are also already working on this exciting idea. And then the final one is, how are we going to sustain the economy through this and recover once it's all over? I mean, the economic data is just staggering. So I mean, I'm in Canada right now. I'm up at our house on the lake, squirreled away here with a chunk of the extended family. Unemployment in Canada went from 5% to close to 20% in 2 weeks. And Janet Yellen, former head of the Fed in the US, says the US is headed the same way. And this is not a short-term problem. You have entire industries: retail, vacation, travel, hospitality, oil and gas and resources, entertainment, planning on going to a movie, planning on booking a cruise, are you? Business travel, even when that starts up again, I think we'll all be suffering from PTSD. And are we going to, go to conferences? So if supply chains are the machinery of global commerce and money is the lubricant, and money itself has been a source of confusion and strain during this crisis. Cash has been criticized as a carrier of the disease, and this drumbeat to abolish it has been growing louder. And or just consider the problem of making payments to tens of millions of people. The Canadian government spent $1 billion trying to get a payment system for its employees, and the whole thing never worked. It took 5 years. So how are we going to pay tens of millions of people to keep them from losing their apartments and being on the street. Well, there's a great discussion, and I'm just going to skip over this because we can get into it in the report. But we have, now's the time for digital cash, not necessarily the community-based caches like Bitcoin or the corporate caches like Libra, but really state-based fiat cryptocurrencies, and they could do a lot of wonderful things in the economy. Second, supply chain finance and trade finance, trains and boats and planes and trucks and escrow agents and borders and paper and faxes and shipping containers and all these things moving around. Imagine if we had a shared network state where there was a single version of the truth, real-time payments, micropayments. This could be extraordinary. Big opportunities in insurance and risk management, and also decentralized models of government. Binance right now is using blockchain crowdfunding to raise funds to help in this crisis. And many of you know about the distributed autonomous organization, a whole new model of the firm that could do extraordinary things, and that one had no people. So that's a framework. And I'm going to come back at the end and make a few of our actual recommendations on what should be done, but that should give us a framework to talk about the issues. Alex, back to you. Alex, you're on mute.
Thanks, Don. Before we move on to the questions, just a couple of housekeeping matters. We've had a few folks ask if there will be access to this webinar after the fact. The answer is yes. We'll be sharing the link in our newsletter. I've just shared the link to sign up to that newsletter, so I encourage everyone to do so, and we'll be sharing that in the few hours after this webinar takes place. Also, I've seen a few of you ask what the handles are for our participants, where you can access their thinking, etc. So I've just shared the Twitter handles for everyone who is participating on this call. So thank you for that. So let's move on to the questions. And we have 30 minutes, but I suspect we might go a little bit longer. So I'll kick things off with David Jaffrey. So as we mentioned earlier, David is an important person, the CTO at MD Anderson, which is a key institution in the Texas Medical Center. And before that, David, you were at UHN, University Health Network, and that's where we met you. And we've been close collaborators with UHN, the biggest hospital network in Canada, for many, many years. So Texas is now really starting to see some of the growth that has hit other parts of the world and other parts of the country, such as New York, in the past little while. And I know that you and your team have been working very hard to prepare for this for weeks, if not for months. And I'd like to have you start off just to tell us a little bit about those preparations and how, what role you're playing in the technology group there. And tell us also a little bit about how you think blockchain could potentially alter or maybe potentially improve preparedness in the future or even during this crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's been an incredible 2 months, basically. Really, in mid-January, we started to get very nervous about this. Having experienced the SARS issues in Toronto, I was personally very concerned about the implications for the MD Anderson and the healthcare organization here in Texas. And so we've been, as an organization, I would say, running wide open for weeks and weeks now, just restructuring everything we do to try to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on our patients, on our employees, as well as the community. And what's been most interesting in my role as a Chief Technology and Digital Officer is how hungry the organization is for data in every one of these decisions. We've stood up dashboards that reflect every aspect of the organization's operations. How many tests we're doing, how many tests were positive, how many test kits do we have, how should we change our testing just so that we can make sure we have the critical tests when we need them in case we run out. Data is just driving incredibly all the changes and responses. And it's just a hunger for the data. It was really interesting, as Don was talking, he didn't mention AI once in his entire presentation, that there's any silver lining in the COVID crisis as people stop talking about AI. What they are talking about is we need data, and there's a hunger for data, and everybody's looking for it. And that just, to me, shines an incredibly bright light on what I describe, and I think this is the second bullet that Don talked about, is really the data supply chain, and how technology like blockchain can really bring that data supply chain along. If we would have had the data supply chain earlier, we would have heard about and known about events in China that could have been validated. We could have worked to avoid. If we had that architecture today, we would be using it on the supply chain side in order to try to design and redistribute the resources. I'm working with a team that works across the United States right now on looking at local demand and where these peak demands are going to occur, where COVID peak is going to happen, not just when, but where it's going to happen and when it's going to happen, and reshuffling the supply of PPE and test kits across the United States to try to respond, because the failures will be local. It's not going to all peak at the same time. And so that geotemporal redistribution of supplies in response to the needs is going to require a really great access to key critical granular information from across the healthcare system. And so that's what we're seeing, is this real shift to the need for robust data. And it's kind of remarkable how governments have been focused completely on things like AI and quantum computing, but those things just put more demand on the supply of data. And there's been very little investment in really thinking through technologies to govern data and really create a robust data supply chain.
To build off of that, so we've heard a couple of governors of states say that they'd like to help the federal government to be the single sort of a single payer, single provider of a lot of equipment and PPE, because they don't want to be competing with one another in a marketplace. And I'm wondering if is there a way to so let's bring it to blockchain then. So if we have better access to more immediate and trusted data, can we do that kind of dynamic, what you said is geotemporal redistribution, without having to centralize this, or is that something that requires that government intervention?
I think it can be decentralized. I mean, it's a matter of how you share the information and what controls you have in place. But we're just starting to get into the space of what do data governance technologies look like. And I think blockchain is really the breakthrough paradigm in terms of allowing us to have the granularity and control. We did a project when I was up in Toronto on patient-controlled medical record using blockchain, in fact, with the Hyperledger platform in collaboration with IBM. And it was remarkable how on a single architecture, you could have individuals control their information, whether it was for research or if it was sharing information with their family or their providers. And it was not as complicated as you would have thought it would be. It's amazing how certain technologies let us bury the complexity of some of these things. And so I think we could put a fabric together that would allow us to share information we're willing to share. There's a general idea that we just put the data out broadly in this sort of shared open paradigm. I don't think works at all. I mean, we really need to get into the weeds on tools to allow us to control the information, have not just the security, but also confidence in the consent, because privacy ultimately is the combination of security and appropriate consent. And that consent tools just aren't there. But we saw in the illustration in Toronto that blockchain-based approaches can support this quite well.
That's interesting. I want to actually just pull a question from the audience because it's relevant to what you're saying. So Don and you a little bit here have talked about sort of sovereign identities, so, you know, what the person here calls civilian controlled identity. And it's something that's relevant to the US system. So the participant Jacques asks, would it lead to us to better interoperability in the healthcare ecosystem, especially here in the US? And I think he's talking about sort of the fragmented care that exists in the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, we have identity framework like sovereign, for example, is one, but I mean, it's one of the most, strongly emerging paradigms for identity management. We're thinking about a paradigm where it's fully individual controlled data. And in fact, you offer it to the provider to use to provide you services that is related to your healthcare. And those were some of the use cases we worked up in Toronto. And those kinds of architectures allow us to do a lot more than just medical activities. We can really actually, with appropriate constraints, use it to kind of predict the health system's needs. It allows you to distribute the supply of health care to appropriate locations and manage and budget that in a much more efficient paradigm. So this sort of patient-centered paradigm, where it's based on your identity and your health records are attached to you, and they're used for your benefit, as Don highlighted at the beginning, the cost of living of life produces a lot of data, a lot more cost generating that data than just sequencing the genome. We call it a phenome. And it's something that you should own and manage for your own benefit, but also for the benefit of your children and society more broadly. I think it's a great paradigm shifting towards much more patient-controlled health records. And that would completely disassemble this sort of balkanization paradigm we have between healthcare organizations that's particularly relevant in the United States.
Well, yeah, balkanized between, insurance companies, between hospitals, and between even employers, because in the U.S., your healthcare is tied to your employment often. I want to come back to that, David, and press you a little bit on what's built today, and can we scale something quickly to address the current crisis? But I want to get Heather's take on this. So, Consensus Systems was one of the first companies really to explore the potential of blockchain beyond just a medium of exchange, right? Like a way to move value around the internet, like Bitcoin, and looked at use cases across a wide swath of the economy and different institutions. Now, healthcare is one of the most important and also complex and also heavily regulated industries on the planet. Heather, can you spend some time and talk to us about what some of the specific use cases, and this actually ties into some questions we're getting from the audience, specific use cases you're building or your customers or partners are building to address this issue, the issue of this pandemic, and then some of these bigger healthcare challenges more broadly, which ultimately tie into solving the current problem.
Sure, thanks, Alex. It's interesting when we talk about applying supply chain thinking to data, and also then step back and recognize that our current world of engaging with data involves infinite copying of that data. So when we think about supply chain, there is intrinsic scarcity. There are singletons, there are individual units that move from place to place. Very often something that confounds supply chain metaphors with respect to data is that we're talking about infinitely copying data that then requires governance and compliance. And the organizations that hold that now copied data have new obligations under the law that vary by jurisdiction to which they must now uphold. I think when we think about ways that blockchain technology could potentially change that, there are new scenarios where we could literally be moving pieces of data from point to point without copying them, using things like non-fungible tokens if we wanted to do that. Interestingly, the technology creates yet another set of possibilities where we are able
Heather,
to leave.
Can you just, for the benefit of everyone on the call, give us the quick and dirty on NFTs, non-fungible tokens?
Oh, sure. So in the realm of tokenization, most everyone is initially familiar with cryptocurrency use cases where one ETH, one Bitcoin is the same as the next is the next. What is meant by the term non-fungible token, it's very technically similar. It's a token, but there's only one of them, just like there's only one human. You are unique in all the world. So when we think about decentralized identities that are not necessarily, they're unique cryptographically, but unless you connect them to biometrics or other kinds of verifiable credentials and attestations, they are not necessarily truly unique in all the world. Most of you are familiar with all of the comedy surrounding CryptoKitties. That was an explosion of the use of a non-fungible token on the Ethereum mainnet early in our evolution. But non-fungible tokens are a way that you could think of something as a singleton, literally moving from place to place. And that is one capability that versus being copied, which is how everything works today. That's one set of capabilities that this family of technologies introduces. But very importantly, it also introduces an additional set where the thing that we actually want often is not the source data itself. We think we want the source data because what we wish is the derived analytical value that we can obtain from that source data, from the opportunity to conduct analytics, to train machine learning models, and to create value in a number of ways. So we talk a lot about getting access to data. We think that we want source data, but and sometimes that is what we want. But there are many, many scenarios in healthcare and life sciences where what we actually need are the analytical results, the findings, the insights, the knowledge. This new technology makes it possible for us to get those insights, get that knowledge without necessarily having to get access to the source data. We can now leave data at rest and still create value from it. And that is another family of possibilities introduced by blockchain and converging innovations like zero-knowledge cryptography, trusted execution environments, and federated machine learning.
So just on those different subjects. So zero-knowledge proofs, for people who maybe don't know, basically a way to prove that a transaction occurred without revealing information about the nature of the sender or the receiver. So to make something fully anonymous, different from what Bitcoin is, which is sort of pseudo-anonymous. Now, there are, I think, pretty obvious use cases for something like that in a wide range of areas. In financial services, actually, there's sort of a basic presumption of privacy when you're buying and selling securities. If you're an investor trying to build a position and you're an activist in a company, you want to be able to do so quietly. But also, I think more importantly and more relevant to this issue in healthcare, the ability to have data be available about you to a, say, public health authority to help control the spread of a virus without compromising your privacy or sharing any more information than what's legally or sort of ethically required in a given situation. Is that sort of a fair example of that?
Yes, and I'll concretize it further to COVID-19. Let's look at the case of what some nations around the world have done with health status credentials after having received testing. I have tested negative. Here's my QR code on my phone. There are ways that same kind of vision could be achieved that protected the civil liberties of the population where that intervention was in place, and also in parallel achieved the public health goals. And zero knowledge cryptography is an entirely new capability. So I think it's very important that we not be critical of decisions that are being made in the here and now, when the policy environment that was designed to handle pandemics was put in place substantially before the technical capabilities that I'm describing were available. And even now, they are very new. They are developmental and still in research and development stage in many ways. So I think we must not be critical of the here and now that cannot wait for R&D cycles and have to save lives. But in parallel, we can prioritize the rapid development and testing of these new capabilities that would allow us to at once achieve our scientific and public health priorities while preserving civil liberties.
Yeah, that's great. Heather, if you have any examples of the work that you're doing that's addressing these issues, feel free to share a link in the chat so that people can do some further reading. I'd like to move on though to Brian. So this is a health crisis first and foremost, but it's created a number of other adjacent crises, which might potentially last longer: financial crisis and potentially an economic crisis. A lot of businesses are shuttered. Hopefully, most will reopen, but it's possible that many will not. And we will need, I think, a new kind of paradigm or operating sort of system for entrepreneurship in the future. How do we start companies? How do we fund them? How do we sort of scale up entrepreneurship? The recent study said that most new jobs are created by companies 2 years or less in age. So we know that entrepreneurship and new business formation is the lifeblood of jobs growth as well. On the expert call, Brian, last week, you talked about this opportunity and some of the challenges that go along with it. Can we talk about that? I'd love to sort of think about the bigger picture here and talk about how we move forward from this crisis and where this technology fits into that.
Yeah, so one thing that we're going to need to be able to do is figure out how to gradually reopen bits of society, recognizing we're not going to get to a point until there's a vaccine that is not only available, but is widely enough taken that we all have herd immunity. We're not very quickly going to be getting back to, big events in sports stadiums and nightclubs and movie theaters and those sorts of things, right? And part of that prioritization is likely going to be about which parts can open up and who are able to get out. Is probably going to be tied somewhat to an antibodies test or proof of having received an early vaccine. And we're not quite sure how that's going to settle out, and it's probably also not a binary thing. But that's where I think digital identity will play a role. And if society does it wrong, we'll do it as a centralized database, that's government maintained, where everybody is is known either you've taken the vaccine or not. HIPAA be damned, right? But if we do it right, what we should aim for, and hopefully we arrive at, is a way to prove, with a cell phone, perhaps even a QR code that you print out, that you have a certification of having received an acceptable level of either antibody testing or vaccination, and that'll allow you to board a plane, allow you to perhaps even eat at a restaurant. I mean, those sorts of things. And if we do it right, a system like that should make it impossible to collect kind of information, at any of these points of retail or on flights about, who's had that, right? You don't want to create what's, the cookie problem on the web, right? Where certain sites can track where you go. You don't want to recreate that in the real world. And so what we need will be ways of proving I have a valid certificate signed by an authority, but I don't have to tell you my name. You don't have to store that permanently, that sort of thing. And that is the premise behind this movement called self-sovereign identity or user-centric identity, is the ability to present these verifiable credentials that are both, allow you to absolutely guarantee this person standing in front of me is the one who's presenting this credential and who it's connected to, but doesn't make it possible for me to build a big database or profile about you. And so it's really incredible to watch some of the progress that's being made in that domain. And I'll put a link up to some stuff that's related to this, but there are a couple of efforts now to tie this kind of user-centric or self-sovereign identity approach to not so much to the full health record, which I think there's some validity to that and a purpose to that as well, but specifically to this, how do we reopen society? I think a second thing for us all to think about is, if you're a restaurant owner, if you are or if you're buying or selling real estate, or if you are engaging a lot of ordinary kind of ground level economic activities, a lot of that is still conducted in person. A lot of that is still in the form of going and signing a document and needing a notary to see that you've signed that document. A lot of that involves perhaps visiting, perhaps at the very least calling, a government authority to get a business license or other sorts of paperwork. And all that is going to be super slow if we're going to be using it to reopen society. We've already seen state websites designed to handle unemployment claims crashing from load, and like the governor of New Jersey calling out and asking for COBOL programmers to help them fix their crashing unemployment website, right? And so I think a key part of reopening society and restarting the economy and putting people back to work is going to be how do we take these basic mechanisms of starting a business, of filling out paperwork, of engaging with the unavoidable types of things that you need to do with that boundary between government and business, and how do we digitize those processes in a way that still allows for us to have the trust and confidence that we have in paper documents and ink signatures and those sorts of things. And how do we get the court systems, because there's still a role for them to play, to recognize digital evidence, digital signatures, transactions as recorded on blockchain platforms, that sort of thing, as valid transactions in the establishment of business, the conduct of business, should they ever have to adjudicate a business dispute, right? So those are things that are certainly on our minds. It's at Hyperledger, we have obviously a lot of involvement in digital identity activities. Actually, one thing I'll put is a link to a page that a wiki page we've been collecting some notes related to efforts out there in our community and others around different COVID-19 responses. response efforts. It's an open wiki. Please feel free to contribute it, or if you have questions, you can email me. I'll put my email link in there, and perhaps we can work together on that. But there is a link from there to a couple of verifiable credentials projects, and then I think the supply chain stuff is going to start to take off. We already see a lot of use for this, as has been talked about, for traceability and optimization. If anything, this is demonstrating just how fragile the medical device and PPE supply chains have been. There are, we've kind of cobbled it together with baling wire and Scotch tape to date, and it's time to really systematize these, make them anti-fragile. And I think blockchain technology has a big role to play in that.
Thanks, Brian. So let's move to questions from the audience, and it's all very relevant. Great questions so far, so thank you very much. If we don't get around to your question, it's not because we don't think it's worthwhile. If there's just so many here, we're like drinking from a fire hose. There are a couple here that are related, and I want Brian, I was hoping you could react to them first. We get the question, when it comes to times of pandemics and health data, there is more than just processing the data, but actually collecting the right data and asking the right questions that may not be collected by a device. Therefore, how do you see the interface of people-based coordination in addition to the data sharing aspects provided through blockchain? Someone else asks a related question, which I think is helpful to contextualize this. Who should be the root certificate authority for such endeavors in healthcare self-sovereign identity? Should we establish an independent trusted body? Who can then extend it, or should it be the government, banks, et cetera? So this sort of goes to the root of the data itself, how it's collected, how it's authorized, what is the input sort of process, and how do we authenticate it? Because if the data is bad, then that creates bad health outcomes for individuals and also isn't helpful for the system either. So Brian, do you want to launch into that?
Yeah, so the nice thing about the self-sovereign identity architecture is, unlike, say, the domain name system, we don't have to choose a root of authority. You don't have to anoint an ICANN as the root of authority for medical data, right? Because that, and medical certifications, did you take a valid antibodies test that has been certified as being valid versus something, that fell off the back of a truck or something like that, right? Or a fraudulent test, right? Instead, the parties that care about this can say, here are the authorities we trust when it comes to that health data, and that's different from the authorities we trust when it comes to issuing academic credentials, right? Your diploma is valid, and that can be different from trusting government as the issuer of driver's licenses, right? You don't want 1,000 issuers of driver's licenses. You kind of want to trust that process is kind of government managed, right? So there is a need to talk about support of underlying infrastructure, and this is where things like the Sovereign Foundations Network comes in, or other digital identity networks. But I think even there, we're going to be able to have optionality and choice of those underlying networks. It'll all come together, frankly, at the end user in something that looks like a wallet that is consistent across all these different networks and certifications, and try to simplify that in the same way that Apple Pay or Google Pay or other wallets kind of simplify your payment mechanisms.
So let's use a practical example. David Jaffrey's the chief CTO at MD Anderson. So if the Texas Medical Center or University Health Network, where he was before, does a test, then we should have a way of knowing that when it says that it's from MD Anderson, or it's from Texas Medical Center, from UHN, that is in fact the root source of that test. And that's an interesting segue into another question that someone asked, which is the blockchain space all over is suffering from balkanization associated with competing platforms. So how do you see the COVID-19 response accelerating a global blockchain akin to the global internet? And I think that sort of speaks to not just the platform itself, but to a common set of standards or rules. Heather wants to jump in on this, so please, Heather, take it away.
So on the point of platform balkanization, fully agree that it is a challenge in our industry right now, and it's one that is particularly painful in healthcare and life sciences, which now has been amplified and turned up to screaming volume due to our pandemic emergency. I think we have new opportunities, just as we need to accelerate many processes that happen too slowly or with too much friction today. We need to accelerate and rethink the process of standards development. And one example of some very creative work in that area is happening at IEEE with their open source standards movement that allows us to rethink the creation and administration of standards into something that is much more real time, and which one fact remains regarding interoperability: you can't build everywhere at once. No one can afford to build everything everywhere at once. You've got to build somewhere. And the approach that we're taking, and that others may be able to also support, is a standards-driven model, but where standards are reconsidered and reevaluated in their cadence and their accessibility and the timeliness within which they can be agile and adopted. Is that there's no question that the pacing of standards development historically is completely mismatched with the pacing that we need to work with now. But we do have some creative new options, and I think those are really worth exploring and considering.
Thanks, Heather. David, you wanted to comment on that issue of how do you trust the lab test? How do we know the data is accurate?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge problem in healthcare. I mean, the cost of measurement has plummeted. It's the experience we all have, whether iPhones or the same things happening in medicine. Even in the context of COVID-19 testing, there are so many different tests with such variability in sensitivity and specificity being rolled out simultaneously across the planet. It's quite remarkable. This question about how do we trust the observation is key, that we capture all the other elements around that measurement, the sort of so-called metadata associated with that. And rich systems that support the capture of the digital information around the observation is going to be key. But then propagating the derivatives from that observation is also key. That's the provenance problem, which then reinforces this idea of a data supply chain. And that goes back to Heather's comments around wanting the insight, but not necessarily wanting the data. But we want to know that the insight came from robust data, that we can trust it. And the trust fabric paradigm associated with the blockchain architecture is incredibly powerful. The FDA doesn't want devices, AI algorithms that haven't been derived from data that they know to be rigorous. How are we going to validate that medical data hasn't been manufactured through mimicking systems? There's lots of mimicry architecture from the AI perspectives. These adversarial networks, for example, can generate data. So it's very important that as the more measurement comes into the system, we're able to track that and understand the context of it. And the digital architecture to support that, I think, is going to be key.
Thanks, David. A little bit of a turn here to a different kind of question, and I'm conscious of time, but we want to get a few of these answered. From Rajdeep Ghosh, how do we apply blockchain to incentivize healthy behavior and promote preventative healthcare and wellness? Is there any work going on in the industry on that front? So not how do we solve this crisis, but maybe how do we create a healthier population? What incentives do we use? One of the before I get answers, one of the principles from the report was to develop systems for incentivizing certain kinds of behavior using crypto economics. I'm not sure who wants to answer that, but I think it's a worthy question. So I'll leave it to you. Heather, go for it.
I'll jump in really quickly. One of the things that I think we need to apply as we consider optimization of crypto economic incentives, machine learning historically has been built around optimization scenarios, and this one is no different. We need to recognize we're dealing with complex adaptive systems. We need simulations that allow us to model those, and we need to activate machine intelligences to give us hypotheses on how to optimize those incentives that we then can test in production, which is the real world crypto economic system. So in our present model, we're missing a vital piece of what would be necessary to make that work, which is the use of simulations. And those could be intelligent agent-based simulations and others. Dr. Jaffrey, it sounds like you want to
jump in for sure. I mean, this is key. I mean, we could run without necessarily seeing the individual, but statistical summaries of the data. So sharing with constraints under robust architecture, we could simulate all possible scenarios. And this is something that we hardly do anything with now. And then we could take an approach. Is it the Swedish approach to responding to COVID, or is it the US approach? Or is it the South Korean approach, where they use information locally created to adapt local responses. These are giving people data and intelligence to make decisions will allow us to not have the same degree of lockdown we have right now in response to COVID, for example, in the United States. It's the lack of information sharing that's resulting in the biggest impact on the economy right now. And if the governments could just realize that a little bit of investment in technology allow us to govern data more rigorously, makes us robust under these kinds of conditions, it pays for itself like over and over and over again.
Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that, yeah, I think we can use this technology to help change the relationship people have with their health data away from it being something that's stored on a server somewhere and hopefully followed or stored in paper records at your physician's clinic, into something that you carry around with you, take between providers. And when you see a new provider or have to see a specialist, all of that comes with it. And that those new providers can trust that information. And it's that trust thing. I mean, I was working on portable medical records 10 years ago with Health and Human Services and others. And all of the web services protocols are there, all of the standards are there. What was always missing was the trust framework for enabling this kind of sharing, especially one that put patients at the center of health information exchange. And perhaps this is finally enough incentive for us to make that cultural shift away from kind of physician-centered healthcare records or EMR-centered or insurance company-centered towards truly patient-centered healthcare records.
Yeah. It's very empowering. I mean, we've had a conversation with the Office of Science, Technology and Policy in Washington over the past several months around the importance of these kinds of technologies. And it's remarkable that there's nothing in the federal strategy on these kinds of technologies, really from a governance perspective. A lot of focus on compute, but not necessarily a focus on how do we make data move while respecting the rights and consents of individuals. And I think we have to just get that more and more in the foreground. And it's just going to require innovation and creation of new technologies. But I mean, the payback is huge.
Well, it's going to take innovation. It's also going to take the will to get it done. And I think what all of you have shown is that there's a lot of will, and if there's a will, there's a way. So I'm optimistic. In the report, there are plenty more insights from all of the panelists. We're going to share a link to that report shortly. And as I've mentioned already in the chat, if you sign up for our newsletter, we will also send a link to this webinar. You'll be able to view it. We encourage you, obviously, to share it with friends and colleagues. It's 2:05. I wish we had more time to answer all of your questions. There's some great questions coming in still, even as we wind things down. So I apologize for not getting around to that, but it's obvious that we will want to do this again. And we hope that the folks on the call will be joining us for a follow-up. With that, I'll hand it over to Don Tapscott to provide some closing remarks.
Can you see the screen now?
Mm-hmm.
I find I'm much more profound when I'm unmuted. Maybe not. Anyway, well, that was great. An embarrassment of riches. Thanks to everyone for coming out. The questions are amazing, and this will be continued. The conversation will be continued online at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. And just a couple of quick things about the conversation. Yeah, I think Brian and David kind of, well, everyone's nailed it about this idea of a self-sovereign health record, that when you know that you are the owner of your health record and you have some responsibility for that data, there are all these intrinsic rewards from that. And you're going to want to make that data available in an appropriate way. And this is part of the shift from a sort of clinician-oriented model of healthcare. You know, I'm a doctor, I have knowledge, you're a patient, you don't, get ready, I'm going to deliver healthcare to you, and you only get it when you're in the system, which, by the way, is why it costs so much. And please don't try and go on the internet or collaborate with others because you're going to get all kinds of bad information. Well, we could move towards a very different model where citizens and patients are co-creating their own wellness and health. You know, patients like me right now has a platform where there are thousands of people who have COVID-19 who are on there collaborating with each other and learning about how to manage the thing and how to reduce the symptoms and so on. And this is the this is the really big promise around technology in healthcare, is to change the whole paradigm. By the way, you end up with better health and lower cost as well. Heather mentioned the IEEE. The IEEE conference was scheduled, a global conference. They had 500 experts on standards in blockchain coming from all around the world to Toronto. And rather than canceling it, it's a virtual conference. So you can just Google IEEE blockchain conference. I'm the opening speaker at that, and Alex is chairing a keynote panel on the second day, and we'll be digging more into all of this stuff. And in terms of interoperability, lots of great things going on. Brian didn't get a chance to talk about Hyperledger Besu, but this is, Heather could have talked about it too, but these two platforms being able to do some initial interoperability. And we're in the early days of that, but imagine what a portable self-sovereign patient record across different platforms could mean. I just wanted to end with a very quick thing. You'll read in the report, which, by the way, you can get this report right here. So it's now available. It's 2 o'clock. It's just blockchainresearchinstitute.org. That's our website. And it's blockchain and pandemics, blockchain-and-pandemics. And in there, you'll see a bunch of recommendations, but I'll just give you a little inkling. Governments, as David said, they've got to wake up to this blockchain opportunity. Every national government should create an emergency task force on medical data and start planning and implementing blockchain initiatives. Governments can stimulate the development of technology firms that are working on solutions in this space in all kinds of ways. One is that they can just act as a model user of these important platforms and applications. Governments can focus on the supply side of the market for data, as David said, not just the demand side, where tools like AI use data. And that means passing legislation to mobilize stakeholders around creating self-sovereign identities and citizen-owned healthcare records. Government should pilot blockchain incentive systems for motivating people to do the right thing. They should partner with medical professional associations and other players to implement blockchain credential systems. Governments are the largest supply chains in the world. Hello. And many right now are involved in producing medical equipment and provisions. They should rapidly pilot what we call asset chains, as described in the report. And central banks should move quickly to create digital fiat currencies. And the International Monetary Fund should roll up these fiat-based currencies into a global hegemonic synthetic cryptocurrency. What an extraordinary thing that could be for the world if it's done right. It could be a terrifying thing if it's not. So those are just some of the things that governments can do. And I wanted to close with this appeal to all the people on the webinar. This is a new paradigm in how technology can help create public health. And more broadly, a new paradigm in how technology can contribute to wellness and prosperity and even good government. And you get one of these, you get a leadership crisis. These things typically cause conflict, confusion. They're nearly always received badly. And vested interests fight against change. Leaders of the old paradigm have difficulty embracing the new. By attending this webinar, you are one of many hundreds of people who have self-selected to try and figure out how this next paradigm in technology could make a real difference. So I salute you and we salute you. Let's continue this conversation. This is not a webinar. It's an intervention into a community that the great organizations like Consensus and Hyperledger and the technology side are building, and MD Anderson and UHN are extraordinary leaders on the health delivery side too. And let us know what you think about the report. Do tell the rest of the world about it. We're making this available. Normally, you got to pay $150,000 to get access to this stuff. And all of this is being made available right now. So we hope that many, many hundreds of thousands of people will get access to this stuff, and that it will make a real difference. We're not just researchers here. We want to be consequential in the world. And I, for one, am very grateful for the wonderful collaborators that we have in our community, 3 of the most extraordinary who've been on this call. Alex, back to you, final word.
Thanks, Don. Nothing more from me other than to say thank you again to everyone for participating, for the great questions from our audience, and to our expert panelists for generously taking the time and sharing their keen insights on this. I've shared the link once more for our newsletter. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of a number of community interventions or webinars that we will be hosting, looking at the impact of blockchain on solving global problems, including around COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic and economic aftershocks. There will be lots to discuss. We hope that you will join us. Sign up for the newsletter. That is the easiest way to keep up to date on everything that we are doing, including these kinds of events. And we look forward to seeing you all soon and to speaking with you all soon. Thank you very much for joining.